Well, thank you all for coming out. This is a really big crowd. That's a lot more people than I expected, so thanks for coming. And just a little backstory on why this program came to be and how it came to be. About a year and a half ago, we had a journalist come to town to do a story about the revitalization of downtown Grand Island. And he wanted to meet with the Historical Society, which we did. And then he called me later and was asking questions about downtown, specifically prostitution. I said, well, it really isn't an area that I do research on. That's not one of my focuses. But I've heard a few stories, and so I told him a few stories. And the next thing I know, I'm listed as Grand Island's expert on the history of prostitution. I am grateful that he also called me not an old timer, so that was good. But the board thought, that was hilarious, and so then it kind of became this joke that we would do this program, and I said, well, I'm not doing it by myself. I'll only do it if Sue does it with me, so I drug her along. So we're going to start talking about this. We're going to kind of trade back and forth a little bit, and you'll notice from the slide, we are only talking about 1870 to 1920, the first 50 years. I'm sure all of you know, you've heard stories. Prostitution, of course, continued long beyond 1920 in Grand Island. But 50 years is a lot to cover anyway, and we could still talk for days and days and days on just that first 50 years. So we try to figure out how to condense it and get it done in under an hour. So we're talking about Grand Island and the world's oldest profession. I'm going to lead it off with Sue.
Well, one of the earliest references to prostitution or a prostitute is found in the Bible, the book of Joshua, where the prostitute Rahab aids the two spies sent by Joshua to scope out what's happening in Jericho, because he has got an order to destroy it, and he needs more information because it's a huge city. So they went to the house of Rahab the prostitute because they figured that well, it's natural if you're a visitor to find the local brothel, and so no one would notice that they were there, which turned out to be wrong because she had to sneak them out of her window. But before she let them go, she had them promise that when they came back, that nobody in her family would be killed. And so they promised, and that happened because of their help to them. She and her family are spared from the otherwise complete slaughter of every living thing in the city. So Rahab probably lived about 3,400 years ago, about. And when Matthew, in the New Testament, lists the forebears of Jesus, he only names 3 women, Mary, Ruth, and Rahab, in his ancestral tree. So in Roman-controlled Ephesus, and Ephesus was a huge city. It was controlled by Rome. It's in what is now Turkey. It was a big seaport. It had thousands of people visiting all the time. And a 2,000-year-old stone was found, which is a map to a local brothel. Now think how useful that would be. You've got new ships in town every day, people from all over the world, or the Mediterranean at least, speaking many different languages. So we'll put up a sign. And here's a picture of that sign. Now here's a picture. I see the red thing going up there, but oh well.
I'll point.
First of all, here's the picture of the beautiful lady. I don't know, it's the best picture I could get to take while I was there. But there's a beautiful lady. She has a fancy headdress, or maybe it's a fancy hairdo. So once that catches it's kind of the equivalent of the Hey Sailor of World War II, I'm thinking. And above that, in the circle, is the symbol for an intersection. It's a cross. And so the foot tells you what direction to go. So what direction are we going to go when we get to the intersection? Look at the foot. It's the left foot. So when you get to the intersection, you go left, and you go till you see the building with that mark on it, and that's where you go. Well, archaeologists found the stone, and they followed the directions, and lo and behold, they found the remains of a 2-story brothel at that location. And when you went to the basement, there was a tunnel which led to the library about 2 blocks away. That's the picture I took of the library. So you could go to the library, visit the brothel if that's what you wanted to do, go back to the library. Where have you been? Well, I've been to the library, and you have been. So, I heard somebody say sneaky, I'm not sure, but so we discover that in ancient histories that prostitution was acknowledged as a more or less legitimate profession. As time passed, this legitimacy was called into question and finally reversed. By the time we find ourselves in Hall County in the mid-1800s, attitudes and laws have changed a great deal. But before we fall into full-time condemnation, we have to understand that in the time period, the life of a woman who was not under the protection of a man could be very difficult indeed. If your husband dies, a widow who did not have children old enough to help with the farm work or the family business, or they can become destitute very quickly. If your husband is killed on the railway, that's the last day you get a paycheck. And so life insurance, there was no social safety net, and life insurance was almost non-existent. In fact, when my great-grandfather died suddenly in 1908, he left his 39-year-old widow with her 6 of their 7 children still at home, but he had left a $2,000 life insurance policy. And this was an occurrence rare enough that it was mentioned in his obituary. But a woman thrown upon her own resources had few options, especially if she was uneducated or if she had small children that she had to feed and clothe and look after. So nobody actually, well, very few people actually chose this as an occupation, but some found themselves there regardless. Being a laundress or seamstress could only earn so much. And teenage runaways were also vulnerable. They would, if the proprietor of a house offered them a place to stay and a meal or two a day, they maybe found out too late what they'd actually signed up for. And in some cases, believe it or not, we found this in the records, the prostitution was the family business. It was already practiced by a mother or an aunt. Oh, sorry, still me. Grand Island grew up at a time when the brothel was the most common supplier for prostitution, both in the US and in Europe. The owner of the house was sometimes a woman, sometimes a couple, sometimes a man who then hired a woman to manage it. Owning a house was a major investment. It required the building itself, then you had to pay property taxes, then you had to keep up the property, there was maintenance. So some people rented houses to use for their business of prostitution. There were different classes of brothels. Some catered to the well-to-do, some aimed at a more modest clientele, and their furnishings and their prices, we'll talk more about that later, varied accordingly. Each house provided a common area where there could be music and drinking, maybe dancing. Gambling, however, was usually not available in the brothel itself and was in fact illegal to be there. In a town the size of Grand Island, most of the houses would be grouped together in more or less the same vicinity, while in Omaha and Lincoln, they would still be grouped in the same vicinity, but there would be several groups. They varied according to the population that was there. Most were operated as private clubs, but any man who behaved himself and was ready to spend his money would usually be welcomed. Some houses employed bouncers in case a customer made a scene, in case a customer mistreated one of the soiled doves. That's an 18th century term or 1800s term for a prostitute. The first house of ill repute in Grand Island was owned by a man named William Henry Anderson. His nickname was Jack. He was a Civil War veteran who'd served in Wyoming and Nebraska after the war. He was kind of an interesting guy, and I have some of this up here if I can figure out this laser pointer. See, where does it go? Okay. Jack served in the cavalry during the Civil War. When the war was over, he mustered out in 2 months, and then he said, what was it he said? He got bored. So he re-enlisted, and this time he was sent, in the regular army, he was sent to the western part of the U.S., which in that time was Nebraska. He was in Wyoming and Nebraska. He might have been at Fort Kearny, because we heard rumors, but we didn't find anything documented. But we do know he was in Omaha, and somewhere he acquired a wife, and he arrived in Grand Island in February of 1870 and opened the first brothel in Grand Island. He owned it, he and his wife owned it, and he operated a saloon downtown while Anna was the house manager. The house he opened was so far out on the prairie, if you want to flip, oh, there we go, so far out on the prairie that it was called
this was
the
prairie.
Prairie House.
This is 1890.
Yeah, and here is the railroad track. And here is the Prairie House. It's approximately 5th and Elm. It was torn down when they built the new at the time, Grand Island Senior High School, and which in turn was converted to Old Walnut Junior High, right across the street from where Trinity Methodist Church is today. So that was his Prairie House, and that was the center or the area where prostitutes were located, where the brothels were located in Grand Island. So Jack, in 1878, I'm thinking he got bored again because he left for the Black Hills and Sydney, and then he was there for a while, and then he came back in 1878, so now he and Anna are back there again. Well, and I have to tell you, the fact that Michelle and our Hall County Board have been working on the digitization of newspapers in Hall County, because this is where we got this information. Madam Anderson from the paper left town in 1891 with a Grand Island police officer who was 30 years younger than she. And when they got to Ogden, Utah, they got married. So, and she'd been married 22 years to Jack. So she came back, but by 1894, she was back. No police officer, we don't know where he was, but she was back, and she resumed running the Prairie House. So.
Okay, so that area that we kind of talked about with Prairie House, that little map right there around the high school, that actually, Prairie House was the first one there, but it wasn't the last house there. Shortly after the Andersons came, there was another establishment, another husband-wife team. He opened a saloon downtown, just like Jack Anderson. By the way, Jack Anderson's saloon, point this out, was the first floor of a two-story building. The second floor of his building was the independent offices. Just saying. The Mobleys owned the building. He operated the saloon out of the first floor. But John and Sarah Gettle came to Grand Island. John opened a saloon downtown, opened another establishment out in this same area with Sarah operating it. And the area became known as the Burnt District. Now, the Burnt District, that was one of the things that kind of puzzled us. Why was it called a Burnt District? You know, was there a fire? What I found was the term Burnt District is not really unique to Grand Island. Actually, there were several different communities that I found had the name Burnt District. Lincoln, Omaha, Butte, Montana. And I never really found out why it was called the Burnt District, except I did find something that talked about a reference to the book of Leviticus, talking about burning in hell. But anyway, so the Burnt District, as it became known, and it was published a lot about as the Burnt District, there were other houses that became in that area, including those of Molly Scott, Fanny Perry, Kate Beckman, who were all indicted in 1884, along with Sarah Gettle and Anna Anderson for operating houses of ill fame. If you want to know more about life of the women at this time in this era, there was a journalist, and she wrote for the Omaha World Herald. Her name was Elia Petty. She wrote a lot about things that interested her, things that weren't being talked about a lot in the news, a lot of human interest stories. She had a column in the World Herald, and she wrote a lot about prostitution, especially in Lincoln and Omaha. And this was kind of interesting because she was talking about the burnt districts there and an attempt in 1894 to clean up prostitution in Lincoln. And in this article, I thought this was interesting, we thought we had to throw it in. She was talking about the 200 prostitutes in Lincoln as they were cleaning them up would certainly move on to other communities, Grand Island included, around Nebraska, stay away for a brief period of time until the police kind of relaxed their vigilance, yes. And then they would return because then they would have to be back in business in Lincoln before the next session of the legislature resumed. Yeah. So these are a couple articles that we found about houses in the burnt district. These are some of the keepers that we know, and we found these people from different records. We found them from newspapers, we found them from census records, we found them from court records. We know at this period of time there were at least 7 keepers, and they were called keepers. They weren't necessarily called madams, they were called keepers in the official records of houses of ill fame in the burnt district. Now, there was one, and I want to talk about this for just a second. Her name was Bertie Mann. And Bertie was actually brought to trial because she had allowed a gentleman and a woman, C.E. Lewis and Clara Williams, to engage in a room in her house for no good purpose. And this was from the newspaper. Bertie said, she kept a house that was very luxurious with furniture, and these rooms were very luxurious rooms and really well furnished rooms. And she rented these rooms out, but she denied that they were being used for the purpose of prostitution. But she did say that 50 to 75 men, she just couldn't remember how many for sure, had simply stopped to see her elegant furniture. And the 2 other women living in the house were just her housekeeper and her cook. Well, in 1895, Bertie decided to depart the burnt district in Grand Island. And the newspaper actually suggested that the notorious Bertie Mann had shaken Grand Island dust off of her slippers and shipped her household goods to Omaha to return from whence she came. So I guess any men who wanted to look at her furniture had to go to Omaha after that. But it wasn't only the police that sought to halt business in that district. Nellie Thompson swore out complaints, and that's part of one of those articles, against 4 other keepers and 14 inmates. So these were the ladies living in the house. They were the inmates. The ladies, the people operating the house were the keepers. So Nellie Thompson swore out complaints when she was arrested against 4 other keepers and 14 other inmates of houses in the burnt district because she said that she had the right to follow the nefarious business if others in the same vicinity were permitted to do the same. So if she was going to be brought to trial, she was going to make sure everyone else was brought to trial at the same time. So the ladies of the burnt district, and these are, again, inmates, this is a name of the ones that we know during this time. This is the 1880s, 1890s. It's quite an extensive list, actually, if you consider the population of Grand Island at the time. And some of these we found from census records. And Sue talked a little bit about the Prairie House. So over here on your right, your left, we have the 1880 census from Prairie House, which was the Andersons' property, and the 1885 Nebraska State Census from Prairie House. So remember, there is no 1890 census because it was destroyed in the fire. But it's interesting to note, and it might be hard to read here, but it does have, William Anderson, Anna, and then all of these ladies who are living there. They're listed as servants. The 1885 census, they actually had occupations in that one. We had a seamstress, we had a dressmaker, a milliner, a cook. So they had really mundane descriptions for their occupations. And remember that, because that's going to be important later on when we talk in the presentation. But I want to kind of touch a little bit on some of the interesting things we found about some of these ladies living in the burnt district. So Haley Montague was one of them. In 1885, she was arrested, and the newspaper actually said she was arrested for being a soiled dove, they used that word, who was caught being naughty. So Haley Montague was naughty. And she was fined $15 plus costs. Dora Reynolds, who had a complaint filed against her in police court by Lucy Paxton. Now again, this was a prostitute who was filing a complaint against another prostitute. So Lucy Paxton says that Dora Reynolds rented out a room in the Nielsen house for the purpose of prostitution. So she filed a complaint against her for that in June of 1897. And she said Reynolds knew exactly for what purpose that room was being used for, and Paxton knew exactly what purpose that room was being used for, because Paxton and George Wilson, another prostitute, had previously rented out that room. So I know what she's doing there because I used it too. The following year, Reynolds was arrested again. Actually, she was arrested several times, and not always for prostitution. She actually stole a hat from the milliner's shop. But Reynolds apparently was a real handful in Grand Island. So the last time she was arrested, she was fined $20 plus costs. But she was told that the sentence would be suspended against her if she would leave Grand Island within 48 hours. They would suspend her sentence. Basically, just get the heck out of here. We're done with you. Interestingly enough, though, the person that was arrested with her, she was arrested and fined $20 and told to get out in 48 hours. Emily Brown was also arrested. She was fined $15, again, told to get the heck out of town. She was given 9 days, though. She was Dora Reynolds' mother. So that was a mother-daughter operation. So Emily and Dora left Grand Island, went to Omaha with Dora's 2 children, and set up shop there. Annie Burns, I love this one. And I love how sometimes the articles in the newspapers, they're being sly, but they're not really sly. Annie Burns was arrested for being a disreputable woman. And she was arrested with a supposed Adonis. I guess he was good looking. He gave the policeman the name of Hutchinson. He said his name was Hutchinson. And they were both arrested, and they hadn't gone to court yet. They were both being held in the jail. But the next morning, amazingly, they discovered that Annie was gone. Someone had opened her cell from the outside, and she escaped. So they began searching for her, but Hutchinson, he was an okay guy, and he told a straight story. And he said, this woman, she just given him some work to do around the place. And he had slept there, but he slept in a room all by himself. And they're like, okay, you know what, you're fine. Just go on. Just get out of town. And so he did get out of town. So he didn't get charged. He didn't get fined because he didn't do anything wrong, Yeah, he slept there, but it was by himself. Cora Roberts, she came to Grand Island from Des Moines in 1894. And this is kind of an interesting story. And again, this is not a life that necessarily people choose. They kind of fall into it. So 1894, Cora Smith came to Grand Island from Des Moines. Her story is really interesting because she was actually running from the law when she came to Grand Island. She and her mother had poisoned her father in Des Moines and killed him. And so she was on the run. They caught up with her. And then she was sentenced to prison, life in prison, in 1895. However, kind of a sad story to Cora Smith, which a lot of them ended up being sad stories. 3 years into her sentence, she committed suicide in prison. She had been collecting live spiders in her handkerchief, and then she ate them, and they killed her. Yeah. So, it was not always such a wonderful life. But ladies in this burnt district, they could expect to make about $2 to $3 per transaction. And there was a lot of business in this area. You would be really surprised how much business there was. And one of the big areas of business was there was a reunion that was held in Grand Island. I don't know if it was held every year, every few years it came to Grand Island, but it was old soldiers that came to Grand Island. They had this reunion. And they had their encampments, and their encampments just happened to camp on the side of town where the brothels were. So it was reported in the newspaper that one of the madams, after one of these reunions, reported that she made $700. So remember, they make $2 to $3 per transaction. I'll let you do the math on that. Not touching that one. Okay, so Grand Island, it really did try to regulate prostitution. So the first ordinance for the regulation of prostitution was passed in 1881, and there was a $25 fine for keepers and a $15 fine for inmates and frequenters. Inmates actually lived in the houses, frequenters just kind of rented a room. And the proceeds from this were actually used to fund the schools. Now, this is where I kind of got into trouble with the reporter from the magazine, because I had made this lame joke, and you don't make a lame joke to a reporter unless you want it to be reported. But I told him this story, and I said, you know how we tax alcohol and cigarettes today? You could say prostitution was Grand Island's earliest sin tax. And he published it. Lesson learned. Robert, wherever you are, don't publish that. Yeah, thanks. So following the passage of the ordinance, a pattern began to emerge. Like I said, they arrested them. They would bring them into court. They would fine them. Everyone was fined usually once a month. Oftentimes, the madam would go ahead and pay those fines. As long as they behaved properly, the police didn't trouble them too much during the rest of the time. This type of regulation and this type of process, though, is not unique to Grand Island during this time. I just want to let you know that. This kind of whole, you do your business, we'll kind of turn a blind eye once a month, you pay us and then go back and do your business. Because I actually found an article about Hastings. This is Hastings, not Grand Island. And there was a woman named Anna Fetter in Hastings who sued the city of Hastings for $10,000 in damages for allowing a soiled dove cote, so an area with soiled doves, to exist within close proximity of her property. She alleged that the city received monthly revenue from the cote and would therefore be responsible for paying her damages to her health, for her health and her mind and body.
Did she get it?
I don't know if she got it or not. All right, I kind of feel like I've got this long thing going on here. Okay, so Grand Island, apparently the regulations that the city were taking on were not enough for some people. So there was this organization that was started in 1888 called the White Cross League. And the White Cross League, it was a group that was formed primarily by members of the religious community, their ministers, the congregations, and they made these following resolutions, and these were actually published in the newspaper. So I'll just read a couple of the resolutions. It says, whereas there has been and now exists in our midst certain evils greatly damaging the purity of morals and our open violation of our laws, both human and divine, whereas recent efforts have been made to remove the evils in which an effort of majority of ministers of the gospel and a large class of respectable citizens are engaged, whereas certain ministers have been singled out and held up to ridicule, their works and acts impugned and misrepresented. Therefore, it be resolved that every house of prostitution or ill fame in our city is a stain and a blot upon its good name, and must and shall be removed. Resolved that every minister of the gospel is and shall be, or should be, among the first to act and speak out on this, as on all of the questions of moral reform. So the members of the White Cross League, they were asked to sign a purity pledge. And it looked something like this. And basically it said for men to keep themselves pure, to treat women with respect, to put down indecent language, maintain laws of purity, keep themselves pure, spread these principles. Well, there was this war kind of going on between the White Cross League and other people. So members of the White Cross League, there were, of course, as you have with any other organization, more moderate-minded individuals and more radical-minded individuals. Well, the more radical-minded individuals were kind of led up or stirred up by a man by the name of Charles Williams, who happened to run the newspaper, The Times, which was a rival of the Independent. So there was already kind of this hornet's nest going on here. There was also a lot of moral high ground that was being taken that maybe wasn't necessarily due to the individuals that were taking it. So Fred Hetty, who was the publisher of The Independent, he had different thoughts on what that purity pledge should read based on the actions of some of the members. So he wrote his own purity pledge for them. And he said the way it ought to read, and I'm only going to read a couple of these. Number 1, treat all women with suspicion, and if thy suspicions are strong, with thy firebrand and scourge, do therein great wrong, and if possible, increase their degradation, to maintain the law of purity as of no binding effect upon men, as being made for women only. Ouch. Yeah. And this is Fred Hetty saying this is what it should read based on the way you all are acting. Use all possible means to fulfill the commandment, keep thy neighbor pure, not keep thyself pure, even going to the extent of absolute force, and move low in order to purify his heart. And then they added in number 6, which there was no number 6 on the original one. All impure women will I drive out of my city, but all impure men shall be the delight of my soul, and not a word I will utter that shall by any possibility reflect upon any of my brothers of the White Cross League, purity being non-essential to me, and particularly if he be of my set. So again, you know what? It takes 2 to tango. And these women were here, but someone was visiting them, and it wasn't just the people visiting town on occasion. So the White Cross League, it actually had originated in England. And these were actual headlines from the newspaper. Social purity, the sanctified and some unsanctified, hold a lively meeting at the First Baptist Church. Nothing against the First Baptist Church here. They held meetings all over town. They would meet at different locations at different times. Discuss the proposition whether to begin the reform on themselves, the city, the government, or the independent. And finally determine the mayor and the independent of the objective point of their aim. So they were after the mayor and the independent. I love this one. They adjourn without any decisive action, and sin still stalks abroad. And sinners and saints seek their respective homes. And they actually tried to dismiss a reporter from the Independent from one of the meetings. They tried to hold closed-door meetings, and if you weren't a member of the league, they were going to shut everyone out and have secret meetings. Apparently, some of the more moderate members of the association voted against that. So yeah, they actually also tried during this period of time to have members of the league elected to school board, elected to city council. They all failed in the elections. And this is interesting, and I don't know how they did this or thought they were going to do this. The White Cross League actually had lawsuits filed on behalf of the state against Maggie Mustard and Sarah Gettle, who were known madams. And they actually had their lawyer defending the cases in court. Now, they weren't government. This was just an organization, a private organization. The judge, apparently, who was allowing this to happen was not a district court judge, and so it was ruled that he had no authority, and the cases were actually thrown out. So the White Cross League was pretty short-lived in Grand Island. About as quickly as it came, it left. It was only here about 1888.
In the early to mid-1890s, now conditions began to change. Platt Elementary School had been constructed in the neighborhood, resulting in children walking to and from school, right by or through the burnt district. New residents were more likely to be families. A new mayor was elected on the promise of no new brothels, and that measure was supported both by the public and by existing brothel owners. They were on the same page here. Because the Depression of the 1890s had cut into everyone's income, so new competition was not welcomed. An existing madam, Nell Thompson, probably backed by a new resident, he showed up from Omaha for whatever reason. Nell had either moved into, or she might have already been there and just wanted to open up a new house, but she was arrested, and she retaliated, as Michelle pointed out, by filing about 14 lawsuits against the other keepers. And that was unfortunate because that made all the keepers and the inmates conspicuous to the public. And if you're quiet and fly under the radar, that's a better thing for them than be out there and reading about yourself in the paper every day. So eventually this resulted in a petition signed by 61 residents of the city's 4th ward, which was the ward that was affected. This petition urged that the Anderson and Gettle houses be closed because daily, I love the way they wrote in the 1890s, because daily, quote, school teachers and other ladies were being insulted by harlots on the street outside of Platt School. How many of you know where Platt School is? Do you know which one that is? Yeah, okay. It was named for, I believe, the mayor at the time because he's the guy that signed that ordinance there. A new ordinance was passed, this one, which eventually closed down the district, and this was a death blow to the 20-plus years of occupancy in this area. And some of the things that, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but any person who shall be found guilty in regard of keeping a house of ill fame or prostitution shall upon conviction be fined not less than $15 and not more than $50. And they will be committed until the fine is paid. So we're getting a little more serious here. $50 in a depression time, that's big money. And then, let's see, it shall be duty, any person who is found guilty of being an inmate or frequenter of any house, room or rooms kept, used or occupied, will be fined not less than $5, no more than $50, and they too will stand committed until it's paid. And it shall be the duty of all policemen to arrest, with or without warrant, any person found violating the present, any provisions. All ordinance or parts in conflict thereof are hereby repealed, and it will take effect immediately as long as it's posted. So expensive. They're getting serious now. Oh, and another term, frequenter, you see that? It was people who rented rooms, not just in the brothels, but if you rented a room in a hotel or you rented a room in another house or were working in the streets, yuck, you were a frequenter and could be arrested for that. So lots of ways to be arrested after the passing of this ordinance. Now, when you look back at the ordinance of 1891, which resulted in the closing of the former burnt district in the area of 5th and Elm, you might wonder where the evicted residents went. After the flurry of lawsuits by Nell Thompson had been settled, the man who'd come here from Omaha rented a house on East 7th Street, purchased 2 of the houses in the now closed district, put them on wagons, and moved them to the new locations. This was probably close to the Burlington Railroad tracks. Think about that for a minute, as to where you are sitting right this minute. So following this move, the number of keepers arrested monthly, you remember the cycle where they arrested the keepers, they arrested, and everybody paid their fine, the school benefited. So, but following this move, there were probably no more than 2 to 4 people arrested per month as keepers. So it had gone down almost half, and no more inmates were arrested. They were still arrested as being in the streets or wherever, but not here. This may have been, we kind of talked about this, may have been because it was farther from City Hall now. And so it was more of a to-do to hold them through the streets down to City Hall, and that made them more visible, and that made more people annoyed, and so it was up to the keepers now to support the schools. The keepers are on their own.
So we talked about, this wasn't necessarily an occupation that people just like, I want to grow up and be a prostitute. Unless your mom was or something, maybe, but most people, this was not the occupation that they chose. And so that was the case with this next woman that we're going to talk about. And her name actually was Ella Finstermacher. And she was born in Indiana right after the Civil War. Her father was a Civil War veteran. She was born into a really large farm family. Her father actually moved a whole family to Nebraska, went to Buffalo County, established a farm there. When she was 17 years old, she met her future husband. His name was Parley. She married him. And so she was really a farmer's daughter who was destined to be a farmer's wife. Within a short period of time, she had 3 children. One actually passed away, but so she still had 2 young children. And then sometime in the late 1890s, Parley died. And her father had also passed away by this time. So Ella now found herself with 2 little kids and no real good way to support herself or her children. So the 1900 census is when we actually first see Ella in her new career. She placed her daughter with her widowed mother over in Buffalo County. Her son actually was living with her sister, Lydia, and her husband, George Colley, here in Grand Island. And so somewhere around the age of 28, Ella opened her own house in Grand Island. And this is kind of interesting because the houses were all supposed to be closing. There wasn't supposed to be any new houses opening. This was after 1895, but Ella actually opened her own house in Grand Island. And in the 1900 census, it showed her listed on the census by the new name that she took, Venus Pasha. Okay. So the 1900 census showed that she was living in a house with 6 other women. She was the head of the house. She was only 28 years old. The other women's occupations were listed as milliner, stenographer, dressmaker, clerk, maid, and cook. So Ella had changed both her first name and her last name. She took the last name of the person who was her man about the place, man who did work for her around the place. Interestingly enough, he had done some work, and there was actually a big article about this. He'd gone down into the cellar because the acetylene lamps had gone out, and he tried to relight them, and there was an explosion, and so he was burned around the hand and face. But his name was Tom Pasha. She would go ahead and later marry him, but in 1900, she already actually first took his name. And it's interesting enough, her first name, does anyone know what Venus means? The goddess of love, yes. So from Ella to Venus, she was. She kept her name, the years that followed, she kept the name Venus, but then she resumed the first name of her first husband, her first married name, which was Ella Weber, or Weber.
So when all is said and done and written, people involved in the trade were just that. They were people. And they had stories. And they had dreams. Not all of them were realized. But their names were found, people whose names we found in newspaper articles and other places like that, and court records, sadly. Some of their names were unusual. 2 of my favorite names, one was Maggie Mustard, and another Light Jerome. Who on earth was this? But probably many of them used names other than their own. Now, Ella / Venus / all those, she changed hers pretty much at will. And I'm pretty sure that other people did too. Other women did as well. Well, now Venus was a madam or a keeper, who got a lot of publicity in her day. For one thing, she was arrested more than any other madam or any other prostitute in Grand Island. Her girls often violated Grand Island's law, which prohibited prostitutes from entering bars and saloons. One of them was May. She was, in some court records, she was May. In others, she was Marie, but May or Marie Wilson. And Eva Marquette were Weber girls who often violated the law, charged with being a nuisance or with public drunkenness. And in fact, May Wilson was found, according to the newspaper article, in the back of a hack cab. And she had passed out from being drunk. But they couldn't charge her with entering a saloon because she wasn't in the saloon. But she was drunk, and there were 3 empty liquor bottles there. So she was arrested and charged with being a public nuisance. So you can see alcohol entered into quite a bit of the problems that the ladies had, or the girls had. Venus had a wonderfully grand brothel. It was located about a block north of here on East 7th Street. The house cost over $10,000 to build, according to the Grand Island Independent, and it had more than 20 rooms decorated with the most costly furniture. The kitchen was a small, separate building. I'm sure she hoped it would not catch on fire and burn the house down, because that happened. Unfortunately, in 1915, the house itself caught fire in the afternoon, and within 90 minutes it was completely ashes. Since it was outside the city water district, nothing could stop its destruction, and only the parlor furniture and the grand piano were saved. And so in my own mind, I think it was on East 7th, yes. I'm wondering it wasn't across the tracks. I'm not sure where the city water service ended, but you think, considering how you would do it in those days, that's probably where it was. So when you go outside today, just look up there and think of Venus. Shortly after the fire, Venus Weber and her business partner, or partner of some kind, William Flick, left Grand Island. Now, it was said the Venus was so tough that she served as her own bouncer. She must have had a softer side, as when any of her girls died, she paid the funeral costs. When Kath Courtney died in June of 1905 of blood poisoning, Venus paid the funeral costs of $57. Of note is the funeral of Marie, also known as May Wilson, who committed suicide in August 1910. She was 24 years old. She was the one who was caught in the hackney at one time. But Venus paid those costs as well. And the total costs for burying Marie were $272. Venus paid cash for that. And her stone here is in the north side of the cemetery. And you notice, what do you notice different about the stone? First name only. And the date of her death. So I think she must have been special to Venus.
Oh, and then also Sue said it was $272 she paid for the funeral. That didn't include the stone.
Oh, yeah,
And this really doesn't do a lot of justice to it, but this is a pretty significant stone, so it would have been pretty costly. But she also, before she left Nebraska, there's another stone placed over in a rural Buffalo County cemetery, Parley Weber. It was her first husband. So again, I think Venus had a real sentimental, softer side. Parley has a really nice, significant stone too. So after the fire, Venus was again Ella, and she left Nebraska forever. And I know Sue had mentioned her partner, William Flick, at this time. What I had found was after this period of time, her son and her daughter, Joseph and Eva, left with her. They left Nebraska with her. They all went out to Seattle. Eva and Joseph both married in Seattle. Eva, however, she died in childbirth shortly after she was married. Joseph married, had 2 young children, and he was living with Ella at this time, who now took the name of Ella Pasha, so the name of her second husband. And so in census records, she's listed as Ella Pasha, and her son, Joseph Weber, and his family are living with her in a hotel that she owns in Seattle, Washington. There's over 40 different individuals, men and women of various occupations, who all live in this hotel with her. So she really did well for herself. Again, this wasn't a career or occupation that she chose. She kind of fell into it. But once she left it, she shook the dust off and she made a name for herself. She did actually marry one more time in 1927 to a man by the name of Charles Sundholm. So in 1910, kind of leads us up to here, and Venus is Ella over here, Ella Weber, and her 2 children, Joe and Eva, are living with her. And it might be kind of hard to see on this, but actually these 2 pages are pretty much all the same. This is all the same area. And it's interesting, in 1910, we weren't so squeamish about actually giving people's occupations a word on the census. You know, I told you earlier, it was like servant, milliner, cook, whatever. We have prostitute, 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 bartender, prostitute, 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 prostitute. Keepers thrown in there occasionally, yes. But we were very forthcoming, and that's what these people did. And so that was their occupation. And the general industry, public house, public house, public house, public house. So we weren't so squeamish in 1910, apparently, by telling it how it was. It's interesting to note. So these are the people that were living in Grand Island in 1910, occupied in prostitution.
Excuse me, can I ask on that? Okay, so, there would be like, the main person, like, who the owner was, father, mother, whatever.
Yep.
Now, what are they listed underneath as? Did they just list the names then?
Yep, so these, just like in any other census record, if you look at a census record, it usually has the head of the household and then the people living in the household. So Venus is, which actually Ella up here at the top, and then these are all the people living in her house. Liddy Jerome, these are the people living in her house. Pearl Moore, these are the people living in her house. Nellie Hathaway, these are the people living in her house. Maria Anderson, these are the people living in her house.
So over to the right, then, where it usually says like son, daughter, wife, whatever, what does it say there?
Servant, servant, inmate, inmate, servant, inmate.
Servant, okay.
Yeah.
I wondered about that.
And on this page, since you asked about that, this is another listing where over here they're in the public house, prostitute, and here are the family listed as servants. And these are three, they're listed as black in the census. And the one youngest servant is, if you looked at yes, is 2.5 months old, 2 months old, listed as a servant. So I suppose he had to be listed as something, but and then there were some more down here too. So there are some that were, some of the prostitutes, I think 3 of them were black as well. Yes?
Were most of their people naturalized citizens? Were most of these people naturalized citizens? Or
Well, let's see.
Yeah.
These were born in, no, they speak English.
They were
Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New Mexico.
Illinois.
Oh, the one from New Mexico, I noticed this. Her mother was born on the Sioux Reservation. She was from New Mexico. I just thought that was interesting. But here's one from Canada, Germany. No, place of birth. No, wrong column. Yeah, over here. This one's Canada, and that's the only one that was from Canada. How about here, Michelle? Did you notice any here? From other
were
countries?
United States.
Austria, Bohemia.
There's a Canada here.
Yeah. So.
Most of them were from the United States.
Yes, thanks for. I'm sorry. What?
It doesn't.
It does not. It lists their. And by the way, $2 to $3 per transaction. An inmate paid about $2 a week for her room and board, and half of her per transaction income went to the keeper. So you didn't get rich very fast. So. Well, now we're up to the 1920s, and the times are changing. And the profession of prostitution was changing along with it. No longer was the brothel the main source or location of the profession. And this was not just local. This was all over the U.S. National trends included now legislation and societal pressures to eliminate the, quote, social evil. Frequent raids by police made it unwise to invest in or be a landlord for a well-known house. And in Grand Island, then, the locations moved. Where were they the last time you heard about them? East 7th. So those houses then closed, went away, whatever. But now they moved downtown, mostly on 3rd Street. The building now housing the chicken coop had a location upstairs, which consisted of many small rooms, and they were called cribs. That's what they were called, and where girls could host their customers. The doors from these tiny rooms make up the booths in the chicken coop. So when you go into the chicken coop and order their Reuben, which is wonderful, and sit in a booth, the back was a door from the upstairs when it was a brothel. The upstairs of the building, formerly occupied by Williamson Furniture, was also a location. And the Savoy Hotel, that's what it was called then. I don't know what it's called now. It's located on the southwest corner of Sycamore and East South. Now think about that and put it where it is. Sycamore Underpass. on the southwest corner, that might be Pine. Anyway, it was running an illegal house prostitution. Another story the building is still there. Another story that we got from the Independent. A raid on the business in 1921 resulted in gunfire, a shootout, and the former police chief, he was working there as a security guard. He shot a police officer who was taking part in the raid, and they both ended up in the hospital. So it was, the former police chief was also shot during the melee, and it was big news for days in the Grand Island Independent. So, although many of you might have been surprised to hear that there would be enough material for us to talk for even 10 minutes about the world's oldest profession here in Grand Island, of all places, I hope you now know that prostitution not only existed here, it thrived while it was here. And it was as much a part of the growth of our city as was the blacksmith, the livery stable, the grocery store, any other business, any other citizen. We thank you. An hour.
Any questions?
Any questions, or did we fill your curiosity cup up to the brim here? Yes, sir.
Are you going to continue the story from 1920?
Probably
No.
not. Okay, we'll just say it, no.
No.
So,
Repeat the question so we can hear
okay, he hasn't asked it yet, but.
Well,
okay.
he
He said, are we going to continue our study? And we both went, no.
House above the chicken coop, what was that known as?
well, the question was the house above the chicken coop. What was that known as?
I don't know.
what that was actually known as. And like we said, we know the prostitution continued on. You've all heard the stories during World War II and everything. And even I remember Gene Buddy talking about one time he was sitting like in the second story of the YMCA or something, or some building downtown.
The building that was there before the YMCA.
The building that was there before the YMCA, and he actually watched the people go in and out of the houses. But what they were called, I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know.
Yeah.
What? Where's it? Oh, yes, he did.
The what now? The nifty rooms. Edith says they were called nifty rooms in the 1940s.
Nifty room.
Nifty rooms.
Of course they were.
In the 1940 census, several of the women who lived there were listed as living there, and the man they were living with, so to speak, were listed mostly as maids, and their annual income was all listed uniformly at $500.
So Jim says in the 1940 census, the women that were living in those places were living with other men, and they were listed as their maids, and their income, everyone had their income listed as $500.
So, yes, Phil?
A number of years ago, my sorority does it, well, we still do the tour pulse, and that the chicken coop area was one of our homes. And so, but it was open upstairs, and it was still not finished, and so we still had the tour, but there were rooms all down the hallway that weren't open, and we were told that was the way they left them.
Yeah, it was.
That, so these people are remodeling their house, but they left the rooms.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and part of the
this is
reason,
why we don't
yeah,
go
part
on.
of the reason we're not going beyond 1920 is there might be too many people that have connections still, and so we know of names that we don't want to say. You know, someone that one of our friends or someone we know from church or whatever else had a relative. So we just decided 1920 is kind of a good cutting point and done there.
When it changed.
Yeah.
And yes, we did see names we knew that were listed.
Find a grave and it
Yeah.
tells
Yeah, that's where
information
we
all about her.
found it. Yes, we did. Yep, thank you. And it has that she was in a sporting house, all right? So yeah, we did see some familiar names and thought,
Yeah. No, we're done.
we're done. We're done. But I do thank you for coming. And